Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Michelle Robinson, Director Evidence to Action at ANROWS, and today I would like to introduce you to the webinar Policy Levers to Address Economic Insecurity, Part 2. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land across Australia on which we meet today. On behalf of ANROWS, pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Wherever we are today, we are on unceded Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land, and I acknowledge and pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are participating in the webinar today. So we have a different format for the webinar today. Part 1 of this discussion was featured at the ANROWS National Research Conference, and by popular demand, we're going to continue the conversation as our webinar topic for today. So it's going to be brought to you by the panel who presented at the conference. Before I hand over to Hayley Boxall, who facilitated the conference session, I'd just like to give some brief housekeeping information. The session, as per normal, will be a panel discussion followed by Q&A. To submit any questions, you'll find the question icon on the right-hand panel of the screen. Your questions will not appear publicly, but will be directed to the panel. Please check out the resources for this session in the handouts section of the GoToWebinar, and you'll find research reports and other resources for policymakers and practitioners. You can find the resources available for download on the right-hand panel of the screen. Today's topic is confronting, and some participants may find it distressing, so it's important to take care of yourself while watching. If you would like to access support, please contact 1800-RESPECT on 1800-737-732 or Lifeline on 131114. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Hayley Boxall, Research Manager, Violence Against Women and Children Research Program at the Australian Institute of Criminology. Hayley will facilitate the discussion and introduce the panellists going forward. Thanks, Hayley.
Thanks, Michelle. So as Michelle mentioned, this is part 2 of the discussion on policy levers to address economic insecurity. So research has consistently identified that economic insecurity, income inequality and financial stress are significant drivers of violence against women at both the societal, community and the relationship level. But what do these terms mean? So economic insecurity or financial stress refers to the anxiety we all feel when we are expecting to or have experienced economic hardship because of factors like unemployment, excessive gambling, unexpected debts or expenses, and are unsure of how we will financially recover. Recent research from the AIC has found that women who reported an increase in financial stress during the initial stages of the COVID-19 pandemic were more likely to experience the onset of physical sexual violence within previously non-abusive relationships. However, economic or income inequality or disparity refers to the relative wealth and earning capacity and financial independence of different groups in the community and between individuals within relationships. So, for example, a number of multi-country studies have found that the wage gap, unemployment rates, and the level of land ownership rights afforded to women all have a role in understanding societal levels of violence against women as well. But not only are financial stress and economic inequality been shown to contribute to the occurrence of violence against women, they can also exacerbate and trap women within abusive relationships as well. So certainly women frequently identify that their financial dependence on their partners is a significant barrier to leaving. However, financial stress and economic insecurity may be an outcome of violence against women and children as well. So it's really complicated. I keep on saying, however, this is just to kind of demonstrate it's a multifaceted kind of construct. So financial stress and economic insecurity can be an intentional byproduct of abusive behaviours perpetrated against women to keep them dependent on their partners. So economic abuse might look like something like a refusal to pay child support, refusing to give partners access to bank accounts, unequal distribution of monetary responsibilities within the household and things like that. So for example, a case study we discussed in the last panel, a woman I interviewed as part of my PhD research reported that her partner, who was a skilled tradesman, refused to pay for any expenses related to the children or household utilities. And this was despite her being in very infrequent and unstable casual employment. So with this as our backdrop, at this point, I would like to reintroduce our fabulous panel. So first up, we have Moo Bolsh, the Director of Primary Prevention, Women's and Girls Emergency Centre and advisor to the CommBank's Next Chapter Financial Abuse program. We have Anna Thomas from Anna Thomas Consulting. Anna is a research impact specialist and an active researcher in the field of gambling and other addictions. And we have Leanne Ho, Executive Officer of the Economic Justice Australia. So the full bios of our panelists are available on the ANROWS website, and I encourage you all to have a look at how impressive they are. So in the conference session that we held a little while ago, we looked at a case study of a woman, Rochelle, not her real name. So Rochelle experienced financial abuse, emotional abuse, and physical abuse from her partner and the father of her 2 children. Rochelle also experienced economic insecurity, which was both a barrier to leaving the relationship and continued significantly after the relationship had ended. The panelists and I discussed how different systems can both alleviate and exacerbate difficulties for women like Rochelle experiencing violence. So, for example, Moo told us about the banking system and that most big banks have established practices now to identify financial abuse and also require an assessment on whether partners on a loan application are fully informed about the loan and the longer-term financial implications for themselves. In the gambling sector, Anna noted the need to improve understanding of domestic and family violence within the gambling industry and the need for a multi-agency integrated response to this issue. And in the social security system, Leanne spoke about access to payments and income support as being vital for women escaping violence. However, the system presents a lot of obstacles. So, for example, Centrelink provides more and more services online or on the phone, which might not be conducive to creating an environment for women to feel safe to disclose domestic and family violence. And she gave the example of how most Centrelink offices used to have a social support worker on staff at all times, but now that service has been stripped back. So these are just a few highlights from the discussion in part 1. If you are a conference delegate, you can access the full recording on the conference website. So to continue this incredibly important conversation about the ways in which systems can alleviate and exacerbate economic inequality and stress, which can contribute to the occurrence and recurrence of violence against women, my first question to the panelists is this. So sometimes with the best of intentions, policies can actually cause harm. So for example, work to empower women economically can actually result in backlash from their violent partners. So what does backlash look like, and how can we work towards economic security for women without increasing their risk of harm? So Leanne, I'm going to throw to you to start us off.
Thanks, Hayley. So you just mentioned earlier what we spoke about at the conference, which is how income support is so crucial for many women to empower them economically, not just to escape violence in the short term, but in the longer term being able to re-establish their lives. But what we've seen is that that same social security system can be used as a weapon of control and a weapon of violence, and threats of violence can be used to force intimate partners to provide false information to Centrelink, like saying they're single to get a higher rate of payment, or threatening to dob them in if they don't do what the perpetrator tells them. So what we really want to see is better vulnerability flagging at Centrelink so that staff are aware where there's a risk of family and domestic violence. So if someone calls them, they don't inadvertently become part of that backlash or increase the risk of harm. We've just embarked on new research, which is looking at how the Centrelink tip-off line is used as a weapon of violence with very little benefit in terms of actually identifying cases of social security fraud. And it's really interesting that perpetrator identities are very well protected, while the allegations that they make on the tip-off line, the victims can actually have their identities publicly available in tribunal decisions when they seek justice through the appeal system. We're also really concerned very recently to hear about very aggressive debt recovery practices by Centrelink and the debt collection agencies have contracted. During the pandemic, at the height of the pandemic, there was a debt pause, so Centrelink stopped recovering debts. But since that's been started, our centres have actually seen much larger debts being recovered. I can just finish with just an example. One of our centres was approached by an Aboriginal woman with 8 children, and her payment was suddenly cut off. She'd been getting parenting payment, but she was hit with a $200,000 Centrelink debt. And Centrelink says that's because they believe she was in a relationship with a man that she says she was never in a relationship with, and was actually convicted of assaulting her. So, this is the kind of situation that we're seeing.
Thanks, Leanne. That's really, really helpful. I guess just interested in what you mean by vulnerability flagging. Like, what are the kind of vulnerability flags that you would, I guess, identify as being really important for understanding and identifying risk of backlash?
Yeah, if someone has disclosed to Centrelink previously that they fear for their safety, I know that one of Centrelink's strategies at the moment is to make sure that people don't have to keep telling their story over and over again. So they're looking at how they can use that information for that purpose. But what we would like to see them do with that information too is to have something on the person's record that lets them know if a third party calls to try to dig for information, to fish for information, or to provide potentially false information about that person. The Centrelink officer on the other side of the call is going to immediately be alerted that there's a risk here, that if they inadvertently provide information, it could put them in danger.
It kind of leads to another question I have, which is about what are the current mechanisms that Centrelink have for allowing women to disclose domestic and family violence? Like, is it relevant to their assessment processes, to the administration of claims and things like that? So are there actually formalised mechanisms for women to disclose at the moment?
I mean, the whole of Services Australia, which is the department that owns Centrelink, has had extensive awareness raising training, which is really fantastic that the issue of domestic violence is front and centre. But what we would like to see is further work on the systems and the resourcing that enable disclosure to happen. It's all very well for everyone to feel sympathetic or empathetic about the issue, but if resources aren't there, as you mentioned before, for a social worker to be at a Centrelink office, it's going to be really hard in a very crowded open plan space to disclose that, or on a call centre line where you've had to wait a long time to even get through, and then you're talking to somebody who isn't necessarily trained to be able to work with someone who wants to disclose that very sensitive information. Especially if you're talking to someone who might owe a debt to Centrelink, there's mixed messages coming through, and it's not a very supportive environment in which to be giving that information.
Thanks, that's really, really interesting. So Moo, the same question for you. So what does backlash look like, and how can we work towards economic security for women without increasing risk of harm?
Look, Leanne has nailed a lot of that. I think what we would like to see is systems that, even when people are really well trained and really understand the nature of trauma, the nature of violence, and are to some degree empathetic, the problem seems to kick in when systems are involved and systems don't talk to each other. So I was thinking, Leanne, when you were talking there about vulnerability flags and some of the real issues that banks have around flagging customers' identities as vulnerable, and this probably touches on some of the stuff that you're going to talk about as well, Anna. But that idea that we are working with different sets of legislations or different obligations under legislation, whereby I think everybody would like a victim survivor of violence to be able to disclose their violence once, talk about it once to a person who is trauma informed, whether that's a social worker in Centrelink, whether that's somebody in a specialist team in a bank who has had extensive training around the impact of violence and trauma, whether it's coming in through a frontline specialist service, and only having to tell that story once. And obviously that's a principle that has come from the women's service sector, but we would like to see that across other parts of the system as well. The issue that I can see that kicks in, particularly in terms of backlash and system failures for victim survivors, is that there is often collusion with the perpetrator, and most of the time it's unintentional. It's not because a human being is not sort of thinking about what the consequences of some of that stuff might be, if they're aware. But it's often because the systems are not set up to talk to each other and to work in a trauma-informed way, and really support that person throughout their journey. So the issue around vulnerability flags is a really tough one, right? Because I might ring my bank and say, I'm experiencing this right now, and I might only want to have that conversation about what's going on for me, now in this moment, and I might not ever want to talk to my bank about that again. But if somebody puts a flag on my account and says, Moo is a survivor of, intimate partner violence, at what point then do I get to go and have that conversation and say, I'd like that removed, and can you tell me where that is in your systems? And it's really, really tough, because you can't, I don't want to walk into a branch and to have this kind of alert flashing around me and my identity. But at the same time, I'd like to have enough understanding of the way that the systems work in order to be able to make a really informed, give really informed consent about having that on my file, or my Centrelink file, on my accounts, wherever it is. I think there is a real power to the idea that systems might be able to talk to each other, and that would certainly, alleviate a lot of trauma and pain for people. But again, there are all the privacy things around that, and so I think there's lots and lots of considerations around what that might look like. But I agree. I think if we think about, I think about policy in this space, and I think we have to be careful because it's a bit of a blunt instrument. In terms of, I think about the conversations that we were having sort of 2 or 3, 4 years ago with victim survivors of violence around superannuation. I think about what's happened in superannuation in the last 12 months post-COVID, and then I think there is no such thing as a nice kind of a group of survivors that everybody feels and wants the same thing. And so when we make blunt policy decisions around things like early release of super, for example, that's often where the real messiness comes in, because it's not going to work for everybody. And guaranteed, perpetrators are smart. They will always find a way to either scam or use that system or that policy to further perpetrate violence. So I guess my ultimate answer is we need to be building really clever, empathetic systems that have people behind them that really understand. So it's not just automated pieces talking to each other that can potentially do a lot more harm.
I think the need for integrated systems is definitely a consistent call from, I guess, everyone who works in the violence against women and children kind of space. I think that kind of leads in quite nicely into the question that I have for Anna specifically. And thinking about your research in the gambling space, do you think that there is a risk that services that support women whose partners gamble could create more harm if they don't have a domestic violence lens?
Yeah, thanks, Hayley, and thanks, Moo and Leanne. It's all linking in really nicely, thinking about coming at it from the gambling sector perspective and thinking about this research that was really looking at those interactions between intimate partner violence and gambling. And just want to put in front the caveat that I'm coming from the gambling sector, so I may say things that are not quite right, thinking from the intimate partner violence, so please correct me if and when I do that. But one of the things that happens in the counselling area, thinking about it from the gambling sector, is that there's often a suggestion that as a way of helping limit the damage that's coming from from problematic gambling is for the non-gambling partner to take control of the finances. So how about you hand the cards over to your partner and they will sort of dole out the money, if you like, so that there isn't that temptation to go then and gamble all the money away quickly. This is great, and there's a similar thing in the gambling industry where it doesn't happen all that often, but there is the potential to go and ask for what's called a third-party exclusion. So my partner is gambling problematically. Can you support me as a venue to exclude this person from the venue to help them regain control of the gambling? Now these can work well quite often, but if you're thinking about a situation where there is intimate partner violence happening, what we found in our research was that the financial control was an integral part of a very hierarchical, rigid gender role expectations from the male partner. So they're highly unlikely to actually agree to something where they're handing over control for their finances to their partner. And that kind of a challenge, if that's seen as a challenge coming from the female partner or even a questioning, it can result in further violence and backlash to that partner. So we were seeing things like, you know, the male partner was, the money was under his control and to be spent as he sees fit, you know, and using that money very frequently to support his gambling. So the woman may have only a very small amount of money and she may be very restricted in the amount of money that she can actually access and what she's allowed to spend it on. And there was, coming back to Moo's points around the gambling sector, around the banking sector, that there was a lot of coercion for the woman to take out additional loans. There was, or to give him money. There was fraudulent activity happening where he was accessing joint accounts and taking out further money or adding on to mortgages or taking out loans in her name that she was unaware of, and you know, also not paying his share of the finances and using that to spend money on gambling. So that kind of challenge or even questioning may lead to further violence, and we did see, you know, as the gambling stress increases, that will increase the chance of violence towards a woman. So it could actually exacerbate the problem quite fundamentally. Either he will just not be part of it, or it could actually exacerbate the situation and make it worse. On the flip side of that, if the woman is gambling problematically, it may actually, discussion of handing the finances over completely to your partner who's not gambling may actually weaponize things further in terms of the man being able to perpetrate further violence. You know, you're selfish, you're irresponsible, you don't know what you're doing with your money, I'm taking control of all the money and you can't have any access to the money. So it could really work inadvertently again to actually further the violence that's actually occurring to women. So the new practice guidelines, which we discussed in the last session, and I think we've got some links to those practice guidelines now, they're there really to provide information and practice recommendations to people working in the gambling sector, but also people working in the financial counselling sector and in the domestic intimate partner violence sector, to really just alert workers to, this is what the other looks like, this is what the combination of these things look like. These are the kinds of things you could look out for, how to actually probe and ask questions around this so that you're aware as a worker about what else might be happening here, so that you can then take care that you're protecting the woman and not inadvertently leading her into further harm or problems around that. And also I just like to think sort of outside the gambling sector, there's, I think, a need for better thoughtfulness and policies around thinking about how gambling might be interacting with and making other situations worse, domestic violence situations worse. There tends to be, outside of the gambling sector, often a real lack of understanding about what's going on behind this, how this could be influencing. In primary sector service sectors, we found some evidence of some of them not really taking gambling seriously, like that's just a hobby, that's just something he does. It's not actually part of this problem. Even sort of think about other research that I've read, you know, when there is a death, a suicide or a violent death, everything's focused around what's happening acutely in that situation. So are there drugs and alcohol involved? Is there domestic violence involved? But there's not generally a probing around thinking about, you know, is gambling sitting behind some of this? So I think all the services really, again, thinking about that non-siloed approach, need to be aware of this other, and that can be difficult. I think, you know, with services, they're often asked to screen for so many different things. Screen for this, ask for this, probe for this, and gambling is one of the ones that can tend to slip into the background. It's not always seen as integral as some of the others. And I'll stop there.
It's such a fascinating space, I think. I liked the point that you kind of touched on briefly about financial counsellors as being potentially an unthought of point of contact with people who may be experiencing financial abuse. And I guess you're looking at it in the context of, I guess, financial counsellors assisting people with gambling debts to manage those debts. But even more broadly, I'm interested in particularly, Mira, your thoughts about financial counsellors as a potential point of intervention where they can identify these issues.
I think there's an incredible untapped resource in financial counsellors across Australia. You know, the last sort of 10 years, we've seen responses to people impacted by domestic and family violence really shift from being, you know, the kind of refuge crisis in that immediate moment response. But we know that, you know, women, victim survivors, people go to a whole range of different places. And I think I talked about this last time at the conference. The things that people disclose to their bank, just it blows me away, the conversations that people have, either over, you know, over the counter in a branch, or to a, you know, it might be somebody in the hardship area of a bank. It might be somebody in a specialist team like the community wellbeing team in Commonwealth Bank. You know, most of the banks now and most of the financial institutions and the insurance industry now have really quite widespread obligations in terms of taking extra care of customers who are experiencing vulnerability, and that might be because of, you know, financial hardship. It might be because of homelessness. It might be domestic and family violence. It might be gambling. There's a whole range of different things that sit under the banking code of practice and the insurance code of practice. And so all of these large entities now have at least some sort of response that should be, you know, empathetic and trauma informed to the degree that they understand, you know, when they're speaking to a customer and a customer is talking about, you know, a gambling debt or some kind of, you know, a personal loan that has been taken out in their name, for example, that they haven't benefited from. There's, you know, there's legislation and there's a real track record in terms of financial services and other services working in this space, and they should be much better at it. Certainly that's some of the experience that I've had, and I have to say a large part of that is probably because of the relationships with organisations like Financial Counselling Australia. You know, there's they've been training up the financial counsellors across the country now for some time, so that there are specialist domestic, so they have specialist domestic and family violence financial counsellors in every state and territory. I think embedding those sorts of financial counselling capabilities within frontline specialist services is also super important as well. So, you know, thinking about if you are walking through the actual or virtual door of, you know, a community legal centre, for example, or a refuge, or wherever it is that you're seeking support, you would want there to be, you know, some kind of understanding around what around financial counselling and how that, you know, ties into the broader piece of that longer term recovery. It might not be the thing that you need in that immediate first day, you know, when you need a roof over your head, but it might be within the first few days that you're thinking, okay, I need to be able to start understanding what financial independence looks like. I need to understand what my debts are. I need to understand what the impacts of my partner's gambling or my gambling are on my credit record, for example. So there's a real place, I think, for financial counsellors in this. And when you see, you know, people working together across sectors, it's the most exciting thing ever, right? Like, because we know that we're going to get results from that sort of model.
Sorry, Anna, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to pop in on that because it was one of the other things that was mentioned in our research, but thinking about this as well, is that the you know, the financial counsellors could also be a point of advocacy between the woman and the banks to actually say, you know, can you look into this? Can you help us around this? And I was thinking, you know, the banks can also perhaps, you know, in conjunction with this, start to be thinking about, well, could they actually then be more proactive or used in a more proactive way to help support the gambler to, if they're wanting to actually address their gambling, to actually then reduce the risks around their gambling without involving the woman. So it's not actually putting her into the picture. It's a third party there saying, well, we could reduce the limit of your credit cards. We can put a stronger limit on how much you can withdraw per day, so that they're not able to withdraw that sort of $1,000 a day while they're in the venue. They can only withdraw $200 a day, or set up accounts that don't have access to a card. Actually, you know, they're separate, so that you're actually then thinking in a different ways, rather than saying, well, the partner can actually help you by taking control of these finances, that it's then keeping that sort of keeping it between the gambler and the bank, rather than bringing the woman into it.
Can I just kind of add to that? It's interesting because I worked really closely and continue to work with the community wellbeing team, which is the specialist team that was set up in Commonwealth Bank a few years ago now. And a number of their interactions are actually around the gambling support. And so in general, what my experience was at CommBank, certainly, and you know, I'm not a financial expert in anything, but my understanding is that banks would always prefer to talk to the customer themselves rather than a third party kind of, it actually makes it really complicated for them. So it doesn't mean that there are not arrangements where, you know, a mum might call the bank and say, you know, my son and I have shared access to an account and I've been gambling and I'd like to block myself. Or, you know, I have a, you know, my partner is gambling, but actually there's pretty strong legislation and you know, it's more than guidelines around how banks are obligated to act, where you have two parties that are have access to an account or access to a credit facility, for example. And they also have real restrictions around the way that they're able to give advice as well. But it doesn't mean that every time somebody rings, you know, the community wellbeing team and says, look, I've got a gambling problem, they will always be referred on. You know, somebody will say to them, look, have you had a conversation with Gambling Helpline? You know, this exists. So there's that kind of soft referral, which might not be as, you know, coordinated as it would be if we were doing this in a frontline service, but it's certainly there and available. And I think most of the banks will be doing that now.
So yes, Leanne, I was actually going to ask if you had anything else to add.
Yeah, so similar to what I was saying earlier about resourcing social workers, we also need to make sure that with greater demand for financial counsellors, that's also a service that's resourced. We're finding with a lot of our Centrelink clients that during the pandemic especially, the demand has gone through the roof, and people who really rely on financial counsellors for their social security issues can't actually see someone. So it's another resourcing issue. And I really wanted to emphasise what Moo said earlier about automated systems versus human intervention, and how a lot of the kind of risks that come with vulnerability flagging are because they're part of an automated system rather than a sensitive system human system that can respond well in complex situations.
I think that's a really good point. And I guess before we move on to the next question, I just wanted to add my own little thought on this, was thinking not only about financial counsellors and thinking about vulnerability flags and things like that, but a lot of the women that I've spoken to who have experienced economic abuse as part of my research have talked about legitimate debt. So how they've actually been from quite affluent backgrounds and they've been relatively in quite stable, well-paying careers, but they've experienced significant economic abuse in that their partners have encouraged them to buy multiple investment properties and to mortgage themselves on houses that they couldn't really afford and things like that, and about identifying that nuance with these people who present as having legitimate debts but are actually experiencing economic abuse. But we'll move on to the next question, although I find this fabulously very interesting. But to take us to our next question, so let's take a bit of a step back. We've spoken about the ways that systems can exacerbate or alleviate existing financial stress and economic insecurity experienced by women once it's started. However, the saying does go that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So what role do systems play in primary prevention, and what do primary prevention responses to addressing the economic abuse of women look like? I'll start with you, Mo.
Yeah, thank you. That was also a fascinating thing. I'd love to talk more if we can about women who, you know, may not be those who would normally access the kind of frontline specialist support services. But yes, look, I think business and industry has a huge role to play. It's really interesting when you put this in, you know, this conversation in the context of everything that has shifted in terms of the public conversation in the last, you know, 3 or 4 months of this year. Yeah, we've seen huge change and a much greater level of awareness around coercive control, for example. So non-physical types of abuse, as well as the prevalence of physical and sexual abuse that occurs in intimate partnerships. But I think now is the time really for you know, businesses and industries and sectors to step up and really help build that broad primary prevention understanding and, you know, almost a literacy and a language around at a population level around financial abuse and financial equality and inequalities, because there's a huge awareness piece to be done here, right? You know, I mean, we've only really, I guess, in our slices of the sector been talking about financial abuse, economic abuse for the last, using that sort of language for the last probably 10, 15 years now. But if we could get banks and we could get utility companies and we could get all of those places where people are interacting with a system and for that system to understand what it is that they're saying, that would be super powerful. So there's the piece around building that, you know, huge solid base around what is financial independence. And interestingly, an aside, I was talking to one of the people who runs a mentoring project with some of our clients here at Women's and Girls Emergency Centre in Redfern, and she was saying there is a real challenge around when you talk about economic independence or financial independence. It's not a thing that is necessarily understood across you know, groups of women in exactly the same way. So I think it's almost, we need to sort of take some steps back and think about, is there a common language here? Are there some shared definitions? Is there something that we need to do in terms of the basic conceptualization of what economic independence looks like before we start going off down a trajectory where we're not necessarily taking women along with us on that journey? And then I think, so part of that is that broad-based population level prevention, but then there's the tailored messages that need to sit in that early intervention space in the, you know, the primary prevention in the pyramid, and thinking about what some of those strategies might look like, both at a you know, an institutional organizational level, because that's where I think there are some opportunities where people may be more at risk of either perpetrating or experiencing financial abuse or financial insecurity. And actually, you know, the systems and the agencies themselves have so much data on their clients or customers, and they are desperate to want to be able to have those conversations with people and to intervene earlier, not just from a business perspective, because it, you know, it is better for their business for people not to be plunging down into the awfulness, but also because there is a real will to get this right and to use that kind of data in a good way. And it's difficult. It's a real challenge, right? How do you pull the data together across all of the big data across some of those agencies and use it in a way that is, you know, protected with the informed consent of customers/clients, and you know, use it for good to improve systems and to improve general population literacy around what the issue is here.
I would love to hear from the rest of the panel, but we are running out of time before we get to the Q&A. So I'm going to skip straight to the last question before we do get to the Q&A. So I'd like to ask each of you, and it's a massive question, and you have about a minute each to respond to it. If you could do one thing to improve women's economic security, what would it be? And how can you see those ideas being implemented? So I will start with you, Leanne.
I'm going to go really big here. So from a social security system perspective, it's so fundamental to have income support. But the system is based on traditional notions of gender roles. And so you still have a situation where the entire social security system is based on this idea of a male breadwinner and dependent wife and kids, basically. And there are just so many issues in the social security system that wouldn't exist if women could be paid in the social security system as an individual person and not attached to their intimate partner. If they didn't have to be paid a lower rate as a member of a couple, then social security debts wouldn't exist. There'd be no weaponising of job-ins by violent partners. So for me, that is the one thing. And if I had to pick one thing, and for the longest time, if you asked any of my colleagues, they would have said, it's a great idea, but it's never going to happen. Then we have a pandemic and everything that we previously thought couldn't happen, happened. We had JobKeeper, we had the doubling of JobSeeker. It is possible to have something approximating a universal basic income.
Thanks, Leanne. Same question, Anna. One thing, big blue sky thinking right now.
Yeah, for me, I was thinking about it, how can the various services protect or assist women to minimise their non-consensual shared debt that builds through gambling. So thinking about things like family courts when there's a separation in process, stopping that joint monetary relationship really quickly so that the debt doesn't keep building, with the financial counsellors who we've said have been so key to this. Are there ways they can help support the woman to separate from the debt that's not been anything that she's built up? For the banks to be a bit more proactive in terms of being aware of and well educated themselves to be aware of, coercive practices that might be happening towards a woman. Thinking about warm referrals to financial counselling whenever anyone sees signs of this, so that we're just sort of minimising that huge debt that can build up, because with gambling it just can become massive.
Thanks, Anna. And same to you, Mo.
Oh, I really struggle with this. I'm a Libra and I find it hard to pick one. Look, I mean, we haven't talked about this at all, but the concept of universal basic income, or a dignified living income, I think is a really interesting one that we haven't tested at all here in Australia. But I wonder whether there's that one kind of piece that we could think about. I guess the closest that we've seen to sort of building something like that into the certainly the family violence system, in terms of that cash relief that people need in that immediate crisis point, is the flexible support packages in Victoria, and it'd be interesting to see what that might look like, across the system, and if it were trialled in other jurisdictions as well. But the other piece has got to be supportive systems, right? Trauma-informed systems that actually, no matter who's having that conversation with them, no matter what the vulnerabilities or the framings are for that person to be having a conversation with their bank or a frontline service or a lawyer or a financial counsellor, for that conversation to be had in a way that is empathetic, trauma-informed, and the right referrals onto the right kind of frontline agencies. So yeah, I agree with both of you, Anna and Leanne.
My want is one that was actually provided by by a research participant actually, and she suggested that child support debts should be held by the government not by individuals. So if someone is in arrears, that debt should be held by the government, not by the woman who's experiencing violence, which taps into what everyone's been talking about removing opportunities for weaponization of systems as a form of abuse. So, okay, so that comes to the end of our fabulous panel discussion, but now we're going to move into the Q&A, and we are running a little bit over, so I'm going to cherry pick because I actually really want to hear what everyone says about this question in particular. So, taking an intersectionist approach, are there some groups of individuals and communities more likely to experience economic insecurity and inequity, and what are the unique needs and barriers that these women are experiencing? So, for example, are women with disability more likely to experience financial abuse? And what does research and practice say we can do about it? So, Leanne, let's start with you.
Yeah, so one of our member centres just recently pulled out their data on their clients who are at risk of violence, and people with a disability were massively overrepresented in that group. So that's really the start of our journey, looking at that intersection. We haven't quite, we're doing some research into the disability support pension, so watch this space.
Mm-hmm. So another group that we hear quite a lot about at the moment is the statistic that we hear a lot about is that older women, those aged 55 and over, was the fastest growing cohort of homeless Australians between 2011 and 2016, increasing by 31%. So are older women also more likely to experience financial abuse? Moo, maybe you can take this one.
Yeah, look, I think we're all probably, you know, we've all probably heard those statistics around older women and homelessness, and it should, you know, we should be shocked by this, right? It almost becomes like the other statistics. We've become a little bit numb to it, but I wonder what we will see in the next, you know, couple of years. You know, we've known for some time now that women over 55 are incredibly vulnerable, and then you put a layer of COVID and early access to your super on top of that. You know, like taking a large chunk out of people's superannuation when they're probably already, you know, certainly at a disadvantage to their male counterparts or, you know, male partners. And then you add the layer of, you know, what's going on in every urban and suburban and regional centre at the moment in terms of, you know, house prices and rents. And it terrifies me, honestly. I think the potential for both financial abuse within the family context and within the intimate partner context, but also just rising levels of poverty and lack of access into you know, the employment, the unstable and temporary and you know, part-time employment industries that women of that cohort tend to be accessing it's, you know, how much worse can it get before real action is taken in this space? And housing, I would say, is probably the biggest issue, but it will also, you know, ties in very, very closely with financial independence or interdependence and abuse as well.
Another cohort that I think we definitely mention is women on temporary visas. We haven't mentioned during this session yet. No, they just don't have access to any of the basic services, and you know, have all kinds of intersections with vulnerabilities that, you know, make them not only more likely to experience violence, but then not be supported in the aftermath. There's been the recent announcement of finally some funding to support women in this situation, but it's $3,000 max per person. I don't know how much can be done with that. I mean, it's better than nothing, but it's at the same time, there's a proposal to introduce English language testing of new visa applicants. So, you know, the message is all wrong there. What we really need is just access to the same basic support services. And in the social security space, we'd like to see people having access to the payment of last resort, which is special benefit. That's what it's there for, to catch people who have no other form of support.
Anna, did you have anything you wanted to add to a general kind of overview of groups and communities who might be more likely or at risk of experiencing economic insecurity and abuse?
Yeah. Look, I mean, with a disability, that didn't really come up in our research, but I know from prior research, women with disabilities can like venues like poker machine venues because they tend to be accessible to them and non-judgmental of women with disabilities. So that, you know, but poker machine venues, you can lose a lot of money in a very short space of time, and you can spend a lot of time there. So that absolutely can lead to increased debt and other consequences. We did look at older women, and one of the things that came up with older women was that they can, it's much harder once you get older to actually re-establish a financial position if there's been a huge debt. You know, it can become quite a legacy debt, whether it's debt through her gambling or through his gambling. It's a debt that's there, right? And it's very hard to actually re-establish yourself financially. So that can actually lead to women then feeling that they can't leave that relationship because of their inability to actually recover a financial position. And some of the women also had lived through times or still felt they're in the times when their particular social cohort and norms within society were less responsive and recognising of intimate partner violence as something that should be dealt with or to assist a woman to leave, and with gambling problems, that, you know, that's just a normal thing, that's what he does, that's what men do. So for older women, there can be extra layers of lack of understanding in terms of what they're going through and how to help them out of it, but also an inability to actually help themselves out of that.
I'll throw in an additional group that I've identified through my own research. It's women with disabled children, so women who are in carer positions. And this is, so a number of women that I've spoken to, and we have the statistics for this, when they're reliant on their partner as that primary breadwinner because they have care responsibilities and because they wouldn't be able to financially support themselves on carer benefits on their own, they engage in casual employment, big piecemeal kind of employment to kind of work around their carer responsibilities, which kind of traps them in, well, it makes them feel like they are trapped in this situation where they can't possibly leave. So I think that when there are these co-occurrence of vulnerabilities, women can find it really difficult to extricate themselves. So does anyone have anything else I wanted to add? Yep, no?
You just reminded me of something that I meant to talk about last time and I completely forgot. One of the things that Commonwealth Bank has done through their financial abuse next chapter program is they've actually set up a financial independence hub, and it's run by Good Shepherd, based in Melbourne, but people can access it from anywhere. I'll put the link in the chat after this so people can find it, but it's basically a hub, a place for people who've experienced any kind of financial abuse to have a specialist one-on-one financial coaching, basically, to work out what that recovery pathway looks like. And it's you know, it's a long-term support. You don't have to be a Commonwealth Bank customer. It's for people from anywhere. You know, specifically kind of focused on domestic and family violence, but, you know, looking at often people are in a continuum, right? So you might be experiencing financial abuse in your intimate partnership, but you're probably also experiencing it within the family context, or, you know, there's all of these, we're often not just this one incident. So thinking about that in that more lateral way, and it was co-designed by people with lived experience as well, and this was the thing that survivors said this would have been really helpful to me. So that might be worth just people knowing about and thinking about.
Thanks, Mo, that sounds great. So I'm actually going to take a question from the audience, only because the ones that we had grabbed from the previous session I feel like we've actually covered off on. So unintentional collusion, say in banks, so this is touching on the, I guess what everyone's been talking about is unintentional kind of collusion with perpetrators. Taking evidence from a perpetrator and using it against a survivor, surely we need systems of training for staff so that unintentional harm can't happen. How hard is this type of training to roll out? So I'd be interested to hear from you guys whether you are aware of any training that has occurred and how difficult you think it would be to actually roll out this kind of training. Anyone want to put their hand up for that one?
The only,
so much. Go on, Annie, you go.
I haven't got anything on training, but one thing that did occur to me was that, and I can't remember, I think it was South Australia, but I may be wrong in this state, but it was one of the regulators who was trying to address this issue in terms of third-party exclusions, how to actually sort of protect a woman within there, and they were then working and training or educating the venues within their state and setting up systems so that the third-party reporting could be anonymised, so that then it wasn't coming from a woman or anyone else. It was actually, okay, you've had a report of someone saying this person needs to be excluded. Now you need to go and actually look at that gambler a bit more closely and identify whether or not they're experiencing problems and should they be excluded. It's not quite training, but it is sort of that trying to remove and separate from the woman and avoid the protection, because there is that automatic, what happens within the industry is to actually, well, there's been a report, but what does that mean in terms of the gambler? Like, is that something that's actually just someone trying to get at the gambler? Where are they coming from? That's the only thing I've got that's a little bit tangential, perhaps.
Moo, did you have something to add to that? Oh, and then we'll go to Leanne.
Go on, Leanne, you go first.
Okay, unmute. Thanks. So I was going to talk about how in the social security space, it's not just training to avoid providing information that could potentially put someone at risk, but also to ensure that the person is getting the support that they need and their correct entitlement. So to give you an example, we had a case quite recently where someone's partner had given back care of the children to her, and as an act of vengeance had gone to Centrelink and said he still had care of the children, so her payment was cut off. And so Centrelink still needs to be able to communicate with both parents. So it's not just a matter of not disclosing harmful information, but having a way to sensitively get to the correct information to make sure that the woman in this case with the children was being supported. And that kind of training is a lot more complex and sophisticated than the kind of automated systems we were talking about before. But of course, the automated version of, this situation happens, you do this, is much less resource intensive and a lot easier. So it's very tempting for large bureaucracies to opt for that kind of training rather than going into that much more sophisticated kind of training that requires a deeper understanding.
Thanks, Leanne. And in the 30 seconds that we have left, Moo, did you want to add?
Oh, look, I think if we could build better systems where there is empathy, no matter where somebody is interacting with the system, and it has to be a human approach. There's no other way of doing it. We can't build huge automated systems that are going to give victim survivors of any kind of abuse or violence the sort of response that they deserve and need without that.
So, I think the big take homes for me today have been about the need for almost a reversion back to human-based interactions between individuals and systems, the need for integrated responses, and a need for a really empathetic whole of system kind of change in the way that we think about economic abuse and economic insecurity, but also the gender norms that we place on who earns the money and who should earn more money within relationships. So thank you to our wonderful panelists for engaging in this really interesting discussion today, Moo, Anna and Leanne. This is a webinar from the ANROWS series, and thank you all for attending. Thanks.